Hello everyone, my name is Keri Ramirez. I am the Managing Director of Studymove, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to this, our last key data update of 2025. As probably some of you know, unfortunately, we could not have the live session. It seems that, the technology was just not working, and we apologize for any inconvenience. It seems that Zoom decided to go on holidays, and we try, but it just did not work. So sorry about that, but in the other hand, it's great to see that we have the opportunity to still connect with you by this recorded version of the presentation. I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to connect with you, in particular because we know that it has been quite a busy year in the international education sector here in Australia. So we really appreciate that you are taking the time just to connect with us and to follow this journey where we are going to share with you our latest analysis of data that hopefully will give us some valuable insights on what it will be the market conditions and the environment for next year. So we have been crunching a lot of information and we feel very comfortable just to share some initial indicators of what we can expect in 2026. And once again, we really appreciate the opportunity to connect with you once again. So thank you for that. And today we're actually going to look at three main areas all around the topic of what can we expect in 2026. We're gonna first of all look at some of the main lessons from 2025. This has been an year of change, and most of education providers have been ongoing the opportunity and the need to adapt to the new policy framework. So I think it's very important just to take some time just to see how we're going and what we actually have learned from 2025. From there, we're actually going to look specifically to 2026, some of the market conditions, some of the policies that we may see in 2026. And then from there, we're actually going to look at how, in particular, higher education providers and universities have been adapting to this new environment. And on that, I should acknowledge that this session is mainly with a focus of higher education in Australia. I know that there are other sectors, and some of you may be from other sectors like the ELICO sectors or the vet sector. Unfortunately, as you know, the policy framework has really fractured the international education sector. And because every sector is in a very different space, it's very hard just to put an analysis that brings all the sectors together. We will look into the vocational sector and the English language sector next year, but at this stage, we're only looking at higher education. So I just want to acknowledge that. I still think that some of the lessons are still valuable for other sectors, but that's just the main focus of this topic. So we're actually using public domain information. Feel free to share, feel free to reuse this analysis. And actually what we are expecting is that this initial analysis helps you just to complement your own views. I know that every different university has different ways to interpret the data or has in a different position. So what we are just trying is just to assist the sector in this period of change. And this period of change definitely started in 2025. In fact, I think it started in 2024, in particular when the Australian government was unable just to vote the changes into the ESOS Act. I think that led to the very rapid change into what is called Ministerial Direction 111, which it was a fundamental change in which universities engage with international applicants. And I think that it has been such a busy and hectic year for the sector that we haven't been able really just to look back and see how we are going. So this initial chart, I think it shows what it has been the effects in policies across the big four destinations, and where is Australia placing based on those changes that the main study destinations have been actually facing. So let me just share with you what it has been an estimate on the growth of what we will call in Australia an international student commencements in higher education in particular. So this is just hard data. It's not searches or web traffic or a survey. This is probably the best metrics that you can use and most up-to-date metrics that you can use just to measure the effects across the big four. Starting with the US, with data that it was recently published, we know that a survey of more than 800 higher education providers basically shows that on aggregate, the US is expecting to have a decrease of about 17% in comparison to the last academic year. These are the effects, of course, on the changes and the narrative that the American government has. And this is what the sector is expected it will be the effects on that. Canada also is expecting to have a very significant drop in commencements when you see the study permits basically that they were issued for 2025 in comparison to 2024. The difference at the moment shows a drop of about 38%. And this is the result of very hard caps and definitely a completely change in the policy that the Canadian government had in comparison with previous years. The UK is actually bouncing back after a couple of years of being shaking. If you look at the last 4 quarters reported by the UK government in visas issues for basically university programs, they're actually having an increase of 9%. So they're actually bouncing back, which is actually something that is different to what everybody will imagine. So they're actually having a growth in the student visas of 9%. And here in Australia, we're expecting to have a growth in commencements of only 1%. At the moment, we have data all the way to September, but we can easily estimate that the result will actually take us to a growth of 1%. So basically, flat numbers in the number of commencements. Now, I just want to include a study destination that we know is not a big four, but is our close neighbor, New Zealand, which we actually have been very, very happy to see that after years of really having difficulties in the New Zealand international education sector due to closing the borders and the response to COVID, it's great to see that the recovery in New Zealand is happening and is ongoing. And it seems that this year, looking at the first time student visas for university programs, they will continue having a growth of 9.4%. Now, I just want to take a little bit of time, and I think this really helps us just to get some perspective. I think that we haven't been able really just to get a sense of achievement here in Australia of how important and remarkable is this result. And it's remarkable because different to what we have seen in other study destinations, and yet it's true we don't have the challenge of having, for example, a perception of not being as welcoming like in the US or the hard caps that they have in Canada. But for education providers, it has been extremely difficult just to navigate all the changes that we had here in Australia. It was not only one change, it has been 2 years of ongoing changes in the policy and adding more and more and more and more, which makes the adaptation and the way in which we can actually respond a lot more complex and difficult. And the fact that the sector managed just to navigate all those changes and we still had overall the same number of commencements, I believe is a remarkable result. And I think that, well, I'm actually hoping that when things get a bit quiet at the end of the year, you're starting feeling a sense of achievement, because really it was something remarkable what this sector has done. It might take a few years to look back and say, wow, how we did that. But the fact is that the sector response from a higher education perspective, it was absolutely remarkable. And I think that sense of achievement also comes when we actually look at the actual number of commencements that we expect to have at the end of the year. Because once again, even though we have very small growth, what we are actually bringing to the sector is a very high number of commencements. In fact, we most likely are going to have a record number of commencements for higher education programs here in Australia, which once again, if you step one moment and think about how hard it was to adapt to all the changes and how quickly the changes were introduced, it is a remarkable response from this sector that once again is showing resilience and a high level of professionalism just to respond to these changes. Just to put it in perspective very quickly, in the UK, the government announced that they're going to introduce a levy for international students, and this levy is going to be, it was announced a couple of weeks ago, but it's going to actually be implemented in 2028, which means that universities are going to have 2 years to prepare for that change. We didn't have that kind of cushion here in Australia. Sometimes the measurements were announced and introduced in a couple of weeks or in a couple of months. So that effects and that way in which the sector actually basically adapt, I think is remarkable. And at the same time that everybody was working very hard to keep the engagement with market, we were working in this change in our strategies that is ongoing, as we know. So I hope that we actually, as part of our wish list for the end of the year, that the sector start feeling that sense of achievement because although it has been a very, very busy year, I think the results are there on your screen. And on that, I need to acknowledge and make very clear that that's the story for higher education. Unfortunately, the policy framework has been very disruptive in the other sectors, in the vocational sector and in the ELICO sector, as well as others. So this is just our take for higher education, but we acknowledge that for other sectors, it is actually quite different. Now, these growing commencements has a very clear effect that I think is also very important just to acknowledge. Because as a result of having now 3 good years in the number of new students, the number of actual enrollments, which includes continuing students, but also commencing students, so the complete total number of enrollments, also is actually reaching a levels of growth. It's a 7% growth, what we are expecting for this year. And once again, I think that that's a remarkable result when we see all the ongoing changes that the sector had in the last 2 years. And apart from the many, many, many benefits that, because it has been such a busy year, and you all know all the benefits that these students bring to our campuses and our communities, I think we also should feel very proud that the efforts made by the recruitment teams and everybody involved in international education for higher education has been also helping just to really help the financial situation of universities here in Australia, which we know it has been a very challenging period since COVID, but we're expecting that in 2025, we're going to see again higher levels of revenue that most likely will actually be able to balance the financial situation of most of universities here in Australia. And once again, the sector assisting just to support the funding model that hopefully will be revised in the next couple of years because this is not sustainable. But at this stage, I think that the result done in 2025 is something clearly positive. Now, we acknowledge also that these are the big numbers, and when you see provider by provider, the results are quite different. But different to what we saw in 2024 when it was actually very disruptive, the policy framework. It seems that this year we were able just to start that process of adapting and engaging more effectively with applicants and with more clarity. There is still a lot of work to do, as you know, but it seems that things are actually getting with moving into a more certain environment, definitely. And acknowledging that everybody's in a different stage, we just want to share with you some of the other big lessons that we have seen from the 2025 data at this stage. And for us, this is probably the most remarkable and interesting one. which is the results by commencements by study level, because we have seen a change that we were not expecting, to be honest. This year, we're expecting to have a 19% growth in basically undergraduate students, which when we were thinking about how the policy will change last year, we didn't expect that actually will actually be not as effective or as disrupting for the bachelor programs. So it's really great to see that the bachelor programs are actually growing and in a really good numbers. 19% growing comparison to last year is a very significant growth. And also it's interesting to see the growth that we have seen by certain discipline areas like education and engineer. 39% the growth of commencements in education programs. That's a really great result. 32 in engineer, 30% and management and commerce. Now, in contrast, what we have seen is a decline in postgraduate coursework, basically in masters by courseworks. We are 9% lower to the levels reported in 2024. So it seems that is that mature age group, the one that is actually not thinking or feeling that Australia is such a attractive destination under the new policy conditions. And that's a very important take for all universities because, as we know, it's very, very different to market programs for undergraduate students and market programs for a mature age student group for postgraduate education. And as you have seen, the decline is 9%. Overall, we had a 1% growth. That's what we're estimating. But you can see the contrast between one and the other. And I think that if we want to share a lesson of 2025 with all of you, this will be one of the main ones that we want to consider. Also talking about study level results, this is something that it has small numbers, but it's important to highlight this. We have seen a very significant increase on the number of commencements for master by research. And I'm highlighting this because, as I said, the numbers are small. In 2024, we had about 1,000 masters by research commencing. Now we have about 2,200. I'm just highlighting this because if the policy is creating legitimate opportunities for students to undertake research postgraduate programs, that's great. But this is if this is the result for some sort of like I don't want to call it a loophole, but some ways just to move around the NOSC allocation. I think we need to be very, very careful about this because this is one of those things that definitely could affect the integrity of the sector. And once again, a very small numbers, but I think it's important just to keep an eye on all this, just to ensure that the students are receiving the right program that they're actually choosing for, and they are not actually be pushed to a program just because of a NOSC allocation. I think that that would be really, really not desirable and not the best outcome for, or not a great outcome at all for students seeking to study here in Australia. Anyhow, so that's very interesting, the lessons that we get by study level. But of course, we have seen markets reacting differently to the 2025, in particular, not only the market conditions, but also the policy framework that it was established for this year. And on that, it's very interesting to see we are having different results market by market, but I think there are some very interesting ones that we need to follow. In particular, China has a 5% decrease in the number of commencements in comparison to 2024. We're going to have a very close look to China in the next couple of months because we know that the 2024 results were probably part of a pipeline coming after COVID. But also we want to ensure that this is not necessarily a drop in commencements from China because they don't find Australia as attractive as it was before due to all the policy changes. I don't know if it's because the fear of not getting a visa is pulling away Chinese students from Australia. What we know is that looking in the detail of the data, and probably as you can tell, one of the other big lessons of 2025 is looking in detail at the data is going to be so important. But in the case of China, is postgraduate students. the ones that are having a decrease in comparison to what we have seen with bachelor Chinese students who are actually showing some growth. So we need to have a closer look just to understand what's happening there. And I'm pretty sure you had a really good pulse of the market. So I'm sure that you're hearing a lot of stories coming from the Chinese market. So this data hopefully will support some of the views and opinions that you heard from the market. Now, India, our second largest market, is actually showing a very small growth of 2%, but it's nice to see that after that big dip that we had in 2024, the Indian market, which we know that we have great students from this market, but also education provider has been putting a lot of effort just to engage with applicants, is actually showing a 2% growth and not a further decline. And Nepal is showing, this is our third largest market, is showing an impressive growth of 27%. 27%, which is remarkable how and resilient is the Nepalese market for Australia, definitely. Now, the other top 10 markets have mixed results, but I'm going to start with the extraordinary growth of Bangladesh that actually had a 45% growth in comparison to 2024. And that makes Bangladesh now our fourth largest source market for higher education in Australia. Followed by Vietnam, that unfortunately had a 5% decrease. We know it has been challenges in the Vietnamese market. But also in the group of top 10 markets that have been decreasing, definitely a massive, massive drop in the number of students from Pakistan and Bhutan. Those two are the best example of markets where the new policy framework, I think, is really not working for them. It's very significant, 38% the decrease in commencements from Pakistan and 32% the decrease from Bhutan. But then we have other markets which actually are showing, once again, growth, like Sri Lanka with 4% growth and Indonesia with 6% growth. So there are differences, and I know you're actually taking a different view of how these markets are trending. These are the overall numbers, but gives us a good idea of how markets are actually reacting to the effects of the policy framework, but also how universities are actually readapting to engaging with this group of applicants. Now, I just want to highlight the result for Southeast Asia briefly, because we know that from an Australian government perspective, this is one of the many top regions or priority regions. Basically, Southeast Asia has a 1% growth, which it was aligned to the aggregate growth that I presented a few slides ago. It'll be interesting, and we're going to do some work in looking into how Southeast Asia is growing or not growing. What are the different markets? Southeast Asia is such a rich region that we really need to look in detail just to understand and see how education providers can actually have a higher level of engagement in this very important region for Australia. All right. So that's really the big picture of 2025. And I still think that it was a remarkable result for the sector. I still hope that you still feel that sense of achievement, because it was the market conditions were really, or especially the policy, were actually putting constraints after constraints, and the fact that we actually reached that result, it is remarkable when you really think about that. But for 2026, things may be slightly different, and what the data is telling us is quite interesting. So what I want to share with you is that our initial analysis of market conditions, then just briefly talking about the 2026 policies that we expect to see, and then very importantly, how universities are actually responding to all the changes. This is probably one of the main features that we're going to see eventually. 2025 and 2026 is going to be a year of change, because the recruitment models are really changing. But before we get into that, let me just share with you some of the data that is giving us an initial indication of what we can expect in 2026. In order to do that, I'm just going to share with you our analysis of student visas lodged and student visas granted. Traditionally, these have been a really good leading indicator of what we can expect in the next few months. And this is because, in advance, students need to lodge a visa before they start the program, and they also get granted a visa. So that gives us that leading time frame that helps us just to understand how many commencements we'll have in the next few months or in the next year. I have to say that things are getting more complex. So you cannot say if there is a visa granted in October, that means it's going to be a commencement in February. I think that we need to just look at the main trends rather than see the number by number relationship, because it is getting more complicated. And one day we can actually have a good discussion about that. But at the moment, there's still a very relevant indicators just to understand what is going to be the result in the next couple of months. But with that caveat, that is not one by one necessarily the link that exists between a visa granted and commencement. And we can talk about that, as I said, later. Also, as probably you know, we like to use a rolling average metric. We don't look month by month because these metrics change month by month. They are quite volatile. So in order just to have a better understanding, we look at rolling averages. And that's exactly what I'm going to share with you and what I'm sharing with you on your screen. I really want to go back all the way to January 2023 and then take you to the latest available data that we have at this stage, which is October 2025. And I really want to take you there because I think it's important just to have a better understanding of how these metrics have changed and the level of adjustment that we have. So this is the 6-month rolling average that we had for visas granted. So going back to 2023, we were having high volume in the number of visas granted every month. It's about 30,000 visas granted every month. That was probably the peak that we had historically. And then we had this period of adjustment that basically finished in May, June 2024, because since May, June, it has been quite stable, the number of visas granted month by month. Once again, this is when you look at a rolling average metric that gives you that long-term trend, which basically suggests that that big disruptive period of adjustment is over. So what we may see in the next couple of years, probably, at least next year, is that it's going to be changed, but not at the levels that we had in 2023. So that's with visas granted, and it's very, very similar what we experienced in the number of visas lodged, then this big adjustment, and then being a little bit more stable. But as you probably have noticed, in the last couple of months, it seems, and this is a little bit of a concern for us, that although it's not significant, it has been a dip in these metrics, in particular in the number of visas lodged and also in the number of visas granted, which makes us think that looking at this trend, it seems that we're going to have, once again, stable conditions in 2026, but things may be a little bit softer than what we saw in 2025. In fact, when you actually look at the big picture, at the moment we are sitting at about 5.5% less to the numbers that we had in the same period last year. So basically what the data is telling us is that we're going to have a less volatility, more certainty, but probably a little bit of softness in the market in comparison to 2025. With this level of visas granted, it's still very likely that we'll have about 200,000 international commencements in 2026, but more than that is still something that we need to look into and be look into more detail and wait for more data just to get reassurance if that's going to be the case or not. Looking at markets, the one that is showing a more clear trend of going soft is the Chinese market. Other markets are still a little bit mixed and probably showing the same levels that we had in 2025. So we need to keep an eye on that. But what it has been also very interesting to look at this is the difference that exists between what it will be the offshore market and the onshore market. Already these initial indicators are showing that conditions offshore are actually harder in comparison to last year than what we see onshore. Applicants in Australia are 26% up in the number of visas granted than the one outside of Australia. Each one of these groups, they have different time lags because processing times are different onshore than offshore, believe it or not. But it's a very clear trend that exists. And I think it's important just to understand how different are moving the onshore against the offshore market. And I'm saying that because a lot of the changes in the policies are actually going to be effectively affecting the onshore market. So we need to actually have a closer look at that as well. But at the moment, very similar market conditions in 2025, but a little bit softer if you want to see that. And I think the softness in particular is coming from China, but we still need to wait. And, when we actually come back from the summer break, we'll have enough data just to have a very clear indication of what's happening there. And that takes us to 2026 policies, which overall is expected that we will have pretty much the same level or same, if you want to see the playbook, it will be very similar to what we had in 2025. I think the sector overall welcomes that continuity in the policies. What it seems is happening now is probably the next level on the implementation of a policy. And that, it's very well documented that first step is the announcement, then is the implementation of the policy. But because it has been so many changes now, it seems that the actual execution of that policy is still not as clear as it was before. What I'm trying to say is that the rules of the game are going to continue for 2026, but how those rules are implemented, it seems that at some levels are still changing. And education providers are trying to figure it out why some changes are actually experienced when these policies are implemented. And this is basically why some visas granted are getting granted and not other ones. So we might still see that in 2026. The other thing that I think it's important just to acknowledge is that, yes, most of the sector is welcoming this continuity in policies. And yes, actually, I think everybody welcomes the fact that the allocation of NOSC is growing, is 9% higher to what we had in 2025, which is giving more space for public universities just to be able just to engage with international applicants. But I want to highlight something that I know recruitment teams know perfectly, but sometimes the rest of the university sector forgets, which means that the fact that universities are having a higher allocation, if that's the case at your university, doesn't mean that automatically you're going to get those students. There is work to be done. We have a pipeline of about 18 months. So unfortunately, because the announcement of allocation comes very quickly, it is very hard for universities just to react to that higher allocation. So that's something that hopefully it will be revised. And hopefully we will have probably in the future a 2-year allocation of NOSCs or something more in a long-term planning that helps universities just to be able just to fill those additional spaces without feeling the rush or without the limitation that exists that in just a couple of months you need to bring more students, which is sometimes is just impossible, to be honest. But anyhow, that's basically what we had in the policy front. Continuity. Yes, it has been an increase in the NOSC allocation, that it has been more favorable to some universities than other ones. But I think we also need to acknowledge that, first of all, we are already at 45%, nearly 50% the levels of NOSC for 2026. This is data from the Department of Education. So that means that most of the effects of the policies, and in particular ministerial direction, once again are going to be seen in the second half of the year. Because, it will take time for every education provider to reach their threshold of 80% or more. So that's when is the challenge of how to manage that flow of students. So that's another important reminder that that's when we're going to see really the more clear effects of the actual ministerial direction. But also, it's important just to remember that recently in the Australian Parliament, it was a very important voting that is changing some important aspects of the ESOS Act that will bring additional changes in the policy front, in particular for the onshore market, but also in terms of integrity and compliance. And that's gonna have effects definitely once again in the recruitment team or everybody that is part of the recruitment strategies. In regards to the onshore market, I think it's just useful just to understand that it's about 25% of higher education visas that they get granted onshore. So if the onshore market is affected, that's probably the size that will be affected. So we'll keep an eye on that, but definitely that's something that is expected that it will happen in 2026. So overall, I think when you see the market conditions and the policy framework, it's good news to see that we will actually embark in 2026 with definitely more clarity that we had in previous years, but still there are some changes that it will be ongoing in the policy front in particular, but also very importantly, the next step in this journey is to see how universities and education providers are actually adapting now that we have a little bit of more clarity. And that doesn't mean that the policy framework should not be revised. I think there is a lot of things that actually should be looked at just to really get the right balance if we're actually heading into a period of managed growth. I think there's still a lot of work that could be done, but definitely we're heading into more certainty, which is making universities to start putting together more changes to adapt to this new environment. And on that, we have been doing a lot of analysis, but also looking at the specifics of data of how universities are actually changing their marketing mix. And I'm just going to share with you some of those things. We know that every university is in a very different space. Everybody has different institutional goals. But overall, there are some things that we are looking and we think that in general, everybody's doing in terms of their response. One of those things that in general, all universities are actually facing is a stronger focus on the lower part of the conversion funnel. But also, unfortunately, the policy framework is creating a higher recruitment cost across the higher education sector. And the reason why we have a higher education cost is mainly because of this. The recruitment model is changing, and to be honest, I actually hesitate in using the word the recruitment model is changing or the recruitment model has changed. But I think that we can claim that it has changed because in the past, most of the efforts done from a recruitment strategy perspective and all the teams that are involved are basically just to get as many applicants that actually fill the profile that you require for every program, that they have the right entry requirements. And from there, you just take them through the funnel and pretty much, obviously do conversion strategies, but pretty much everything will flow. And in particular, that final stage, the lower part of the funnel, when the student was basically paying and getting a COE, it was pretty much automatic. But with the new policy front, things have changed quite significantly. And that lower part of the funnel is getting a lot of attention because now it's not only necessary to find that right quality applicant for your programs, but also you need to ensure that they actually comply and they have the right profile to get their visa. So that focus on the lower part of the funnel is bringing additional costs in additional admissions and compliance. You need to have additional staff, additional technology, additional focus in that compliance aspect of the conversion journey. But also in terms of admissions, we know that universities are now ensuring that an admission process is actually as fast as and accurate as possible, because now the timing of conversion matters, especially for universities that reach the 80% threshold. They need to ensure that the applicant gets the offer and finish the conversion process as soon as possible to delay any visa processing time. So all this is now changing and making the recruitment process more complex. And as a result of that, universities have to invest additional resources on that. And that is actually increasing the cost of recruitment. And I think that everybody involved in the student recruitment understands this, but once again, it's important for the wider university sector and also for the policymakers to understand that that's one of the consequences. Yes, we're bringing more integrity into the system, but that comes obviously with a cost. And that actually is something that it has to be important to consider in this process of changing and adapting to the new current conditions. And just briefly, in terms of processing times, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I want to just share with you because definitely we have seen a change in the processing times in comparison to 2024. Ministerial direction, as you can see, look at the changes from 37 to 51, then 27. But now we're also getting more clarity, at least in general. There will be obviously some cases, but in general, this is for higher education, the actual amount of time that 75% of student visas get processed is about 30 days, which helps you just to have a benchmark of how much time you need to consider when you're actually looking into your recruitment strategies, especially in the conversion timing side of things. Now, what we also know, and this is when things are getting quite interesting, is that as we basically explained last year when it was a potential consideration of hard caps, with the NOSC, even though that they are not hard caps, there's still going to be a different approach taken by different universities. So back in 2023, all universities more or less were able just to implement a similar strategy. So obviously, some universities have more resources, some universities have more interest in recruiting international students, but pretty much the same book applied for everybody. But now that we have this managed growth system where everybody has a different allocation, things are actually going to be seen by universities in very different ways. And we're definitely starting to see more and more that there is a group of universities that are engaging with international applicants, thinking about how they have constraints to grow because the NOSC allocation is really making it hard just to grow the numbers further. And then we have the other groups that they have definitely room to grow. We have been doing a little bit of analysis as well on this. It's more complex, but it seems that what we're going to have is pretty much 50-50. I think that half of the universities, when you see the NOSC allocation that they received in 2026 versus the commencements that they have historically, they have room to grow. But then we have another half that basically they have constraints to growth. And that's changing completely the way in which universities are engaging with international applicants and the way in which they are more competitive or the way in which they're actually engaging from a marketing and recruitment point of view. Because universities who have constraints to growth, their aim is just to maximize revenue. You cannot grow your volume, so you need to look for other ways just to maximize your revenue based on that constraint of growth. Once the ones who are actually able to grow, they actually looking to increase their market share. And that actually makes a completely different path for each one of these universities, the way in which they're going to engage with applicants. And for us, our commitment in 2026 is two of them. Help universities in this path just to adapt into the new policy framework and the new environment created by the policy framework, but help universities to understand how everybody is reacting. And for us, looking at the marketing mix, so the different aspects of the engagement, is probably the best way just to understand these differences. Let me just share with you a few of the things that we are looking at the moment. In terms of promotion, if you are in the constrained growth group or if you are room to growth, we haven't really seen a big difference in which universities are changing the way in which they are promoting their programs. In fact, the policy framework has not changed significantly how universities are engaging with a particular market or other. And that is because if you think about it, if a university has been engaging in a particular country for many, many years, you just don't change or detach from that particular market in a couple of months. You have been building relationships, so it takes time to do those adjustments. So we don't expect to see any significant adjustments at this stage. In the program front, also, we don't expect that universities will completely change their offering of programs. In fact, this policy framework is not even suggesting that. Like, if we could potentially have a policy framework that says, look, if you have students from these areas with a skill gap, we'll give you a higher allocation. Well, that's when we may see change in the program offering, but not at this stage. But what we definitely are expecting to see is, and this is in the world of program offering, is an assessment of entry requirements. I think that that's when universities are looking into, first of all, if the entry requirements are making them less competitive or more competitive, and also they are looking at how potential competitors are actually adjusting this or not. This obviously is going to come in the area of academic entry requirements, but also, and the Australian government just announced that this week, the actual scoring or the entry requirements for English language tests, which our analysis that we have been sharing with all of you shows that there are still some differences in the approach taken by universities. So we're actually going to have, once again, our analysis of English language requirements that is going to help universities just to have that complete look of the entry requirements for English language tests that everybody has. So everybody can actually make the right adjustments according to what they think is the right market proposition that they want to put together. So I'll be more than happy just to provide more information about that. But we are very pleased to see and to able to provide that data set to anybody that requires, so you can have a complete idea of what are the English language requirements across the sector. Now, the other one that is a big change, and this is once again looking at the marketing mix, and this is the one that it has been significant changes, is about a price. And this, as you can imagine, one of the big changes that we expect to see once again in 2026. We already have seen some changes happen in 2025. And once again, we have a very comprehensive set of reports that helps you just look from a summary perspective or from a disciplinary perspective, or if you want the complete data set, we have everything ready for you. And on that, we also gonna have once again our analysis of rankings and fees that we know also has been some changes. And also we're gonna complement that with our analysis of scholarships for new international students. So all that is going to be available very soon, and we are very, very thankful for all the universities that already subscribe to this. We know that is a really good tool just to have very quickly, very easy, a good understanding of how everybody's modifying their pricing. And as I said, it has been quite significant. Something that we introduced last year is this analysis that everybody that subscribes to the other ones have access for free, which is called the Fee Watch, which basically is just a sample of key programs, which allows just to, in a more responsive way, give each university an idea of how everybody is actually adjusting their fees. And in comparison to what we have seen last year, this year the adjustment of fees is quite significant. Just to let you know, last year we actually had based on this sample of programs, we have an increase on average of 5.3%, which was one of the highest we have seen in years. Well, now this year, 6.3% for undergrad. And once again, 5.2% up to 6.5%. We haven't seen that response in a very, very long time. And it's very interesting just to see how every university is responding to these changes. I think that also that shows the level of pressure that recruitment strategies are now having. But that's why it's so important just to have access to this data so you can actually understand where everybody's at, because Most likely, whoever you thought it was your competitor from a pricing point of view, probably is not anymore. From all these big changes that we have seen, like universities that they were in the $35,000, after 2 years of increasing significantly, maybe they are close to the 40,000. So we really want to provide everybody with this complete view. And as you can see, this is just the range of increases that we have seen. You have some universities going 16%, 11%, and some others that basically are showing no growth. So very, very important just to see how everybody is reacting, which is the result of the two things, the new policy framework, but also the need for universities just to reach their targets. So yeah, so we're very pleased that once again, we're going to be able just to assist the sector with that. And the other big one is scholarships. When we thought that this active engagement with scholarship was fading away, we saw that in 2023, a little bit in 2024. It's clear that the use of a scholarship is back in the table, and we already have seen some changes that are quite interesting. With things like early conversion strategies, obviously you want to ensure that when you reach your 80% threshold, you're going to be able just to get the acceptance as soon as possible. That stops creating delays. And also, what we have seen that is interesting, this started last year, is more of a country focused scholarship. But what it has been quite fascinating to follow is that universities are now moving into a definitely more strategic approach for their scholarships. We are moving away from those big fee waivers for everybody into something that really helps universities to minimize the impact, the financial impact of the scholarship, and engaging with the right applicant. And what I'm saying is that, for example, some universities are having different levels of scholarships, depending the different academic requirements of each candidate. So before that exists, now we have like 5, 6, 7 levels. But then if you are from this country, this is what you get. So a more sophisticated way just to engage in the scholarship space. Definitely, obviously, to minimize the financial impact that the scholarship have, but still to be attractive and put a good value proposition. So our scholarship report will contain all that information and all detail. And once again, we are very, very happy just to provide that to each one of you when you require it. Because that's another thing. The reports will be there, will be ready. So whenever you want it, they'll be there ready for you. And as you can see, this has been, and I said, this is the aim of our mission in 2026. It's just really facilitate this process of adapting and to engaging with the new policy front. It's great to see that now we're getting some clarity, but we really want to provide the right level of reporting and the data for you and your team so you can actually support the best decisions. And more importantly, to understand not only where are you heading, but what others are doing, because other universities are thinking differently. As I said, some universities are looking to maximize revenue. That's why they are increasing their fees in a different ways to others. Some others are looking to increase their market share. And I think it's very important just to have access to that data that helps you just to understand what each one of the different universities are doing. So our 2026 reports are there. If you need something else, please let us know, because most likely we already collect that data and we're able just to dissect it or to analyze it in a different way. We are here just to support you because it has been quite a big year for the sector, that really what we wish is to be able just to facilitate that. And just to finish this session, in the list of wish lists that we have for the end of the year, we really hope that the sector has this sense of achievement. Unfortunately, 2025 also had an underlying negative narrative for the things that we do. This narrative of, it's like the value that international students bring to our community is not enough. We know that temporary visa holders bring a stress to the system and to the infrastructure of Australia, but we cannot forget all the great benefits that we get, and the fact that the sector navigate this difficult period and reach that record level of commencements is something that is very remarkable, and it has been very special for us just to witness that journey and to support you. And we want to support obviously your work next year in any way that we can actually do that. So hopefully we'll get that sense of achievement when things calm down, because we know it has been pretty busy. But also, I still think that there is room just to improve the policy front. I know that it's great that we're having some clarity. I know that it's good that we have a better idea of where we are heading, but there are some important things that will make the life of everybody a lot easier. One that as simple as this, a 2-year NOSC allocation. If universities could know at least part of the NOSC allocation in advance, that will help with pipeline. That will help just to manage more effectively their strategies, rather than just getting an email in August or October or December saying, oh, this is your... It will be very useful if we can actually have a long-term planning of what it will be the allocation. And yeah, we can have managed growth, but if it's done probably with a better sense of how everybody is reacting. And definitely in our wish list for 2026, we really think it's very important just to revise this level of fees on the student visas, because it's really affecting some ELICOs, some sectors like the ELICO sector and others, that it just doesn't make sense. Seriously, hopefully we will see a good revision of that. If it's programs who are 6 months or less, 5 months or less, there is an opportunity to do that, because it's a very important and integral part of the sector. And we'll talk more about that next year. But something that definitely we want to put on our wish list. But finally, I think that at the end in our wish list, what we want to do is just to thank you for all your support and just wish you an amazing 2026. I hope after such a complicated year that we have just some space just to breathe and to basically start a year that we're very hopeful that 2026 is going to be a great year for all. And on that note, I just want to say thank you. And if you have any questions, if you want to contact us, please let us know. I hope you find this information useful, and we'll be in touch with you very, very soon. Thank you, everybody. Take care.